Few regions in modern history have endured as long and unrelenting a struggle for self-determination as the land now known as Vietnam. Shaped by mountains, jungles, and the sinuous flow of the Mekong and Red Rivers, this narrow stretch of Southeast Asia has for centuries been both a prize and a battleground. From the earliest recorded times, larger powers have pressed upon it, seeking to claim its people and its resources. The history of Vietnam is therefore as much a chronicle of resistance as it is of conquest. For nearly 1,000 years, beginning in the 2nd century BC, the Vietnamese lived under the domination of successive Chinese dynasties. That era imprinted upon the region a deep familiarity with imperial rule and the methods of organized resistance. Through long centuries of occupation, insurrections periodically flared, led by figures who became woven into the national memory: generals, even warrior queens. Eventually, by the 10th century, local rulers reclaimed independence. But the pattern of invasion and rebellion would repeat itself with other empires in the centuries to come. By the 19th century, the new imperial power was France. Through a slow campaign of military incursions, France incorporated Vietnam, along with Cambodia and Laos, into its colonial possession of Indochina. French colonialism reshaped the country's cities, exploited its plantations, and imposed European systems of administration, while also planting the seeds of modern nationalism. From this tension emerged new leaders and new ideologies, most notably the revolutionary vision of Ho Chi Minh, who absorbed ideas of Marxism-Leninism and applied them to the struggle for Vietnamese independence. The Second World War brought another disruption as Japanese forces displaced the French and briefly controlled the territory. When Japan's empire collapsed in 1945, it left behind a power vacuum and a nation on the brink of transformation. In Hanoi, on September 2nd of that year, Ho Chi Minh declared the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam before thousands of cheering supporters, borrowing words from the American Declaration of Independence to frame his vision. But the Western powers, unwilling to relinquish their colonial influence and increasingly wary of communist movements, refused to recognize this declaration. Conflict was inevitable. The war that the world came to know as the Vietnam War was not a single event, but the final and bloodiest chapter in a longer struggle that stretched across generations. It was a collision of colonial legacy, nationalist aspiration, ideological rivalry, and civil division. To understand it is to trace a line from the long centuries of resistance to foreign domination, through the crucible of French colonialism, to the global confrontation of the Cold War that would engulf the mid-20th century in one of the defining conflicts of modern times. In the middle of the 19th century, as the great European powers cast their gaze eastward, Vietnam found itself drawn into a new form of domination. France, seeking commercial advantage and prestige, began a slow but relentless conquest of the region. In 1858, French troops landed at Da Nang, and by the close of the century they had secured control over the territories of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, collectively known as French Indochina. The French colonial order reshaped every aspect of Vietnamese life. The fertile deltas and highlands were reorganized into vast plantations producing rice, rubber, and coffee for export. Railways and ports were built to carry these goods outward rather than to connect the local population. A small elite, trained in French language and administration, prospered, while the majority of peasants bore the weight of taxes and corvée labor. The colonial presence also brought Western education and new ideas of politics and nationhood. which paradoxically planted the seeds of resistance in those who first learned to admire the ideals of liberty and independence from their occupiers. From these tensions emerged the first stirrings of modern Vietnamese nationalism. In the early 20th century, reformers like Phan Boi Cho and Phan Q. Trinh envisioned different paths to freedom, one rooted in modernization and republican ideals, the other in a return to Confucian moral authority combined with Western science. Secret societies, student movements, and exiles abroad spread their message. Yet these early efforts were met with surveillance, arrest, and exile by the colonial administration. It was in this climate of repression and exile that a young man named Nguyen Sinh Cung, later known to the world as Ho Chi Minh, left Vietnam. In 1911, over the next 3 decades, he traveled across the globe, working as a cook, a sailor, and a photographer, observing the inequalities of empire and absorbing the doctrines of Marxism-Leninism. By the 1920s, he had become a committed revolutionary. Ho believed that only a disciplined, organized, communist movement could unify Vietnam and overthrow colonial domination. The global upheaval of the Second World War offered a sudden and violent disruption to French control. After 1940, with France under German occupation, Japan seized the opportunity to occupy Indochina, leaving the French colonial administration in place as a facade. Under this double occupation, the Vietnamese people endured severe hardships. Famine swept through the north in 1940–1945, claiming the lives of over 1 million. During these years, Ho Chi Minh returned to his homeland, organizing the Viet Minh, a broad coalition of nationalist and communist forces dedicated to resisting both Japanese and French power. When Japan's empire collapsed in August 1945, a sudden power vacuum emerged. Into this void stepped the Viet Minh. Within days, they seized control of Hanoi and other major cities in what became known as the August Revolution. On September 2, 1945, in Hanoi's Ba Dinh Square, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam before a jubilant crowd. His speech, deliberately echoing the language of the American Declaration of Independence, appealed to universal principles. All men are created equal. The Creator has given us certain inviolable rights: life, liberty, and happiness. But these words fell on deaf ears among the Western powers. France, intent on reclaiming its lost colony, and the United States, increasingly wary of communist movements in Asia, refused to acknowledge Vietnam's independence. In the months that followed, negotiations collapsed, and the determination of the Vietnamese people to defend their new republic would soon bring them into direct conflict with returning French forces. Thus, by the close of 1945, the stage was set for a prolonged and bitter struggle, the First Indochina War, a war that would mark the next chapter in Vietnam's long and determined fight to define its own destiny. The fragile hope that followed Ho Chi Minh's Declaration of Independence in 1945 dissolved almost as soon as it had appeared. By late that year, French troops, backed by British forces in the south, began to return to Indochina, intent on re-establishing colonial rule. Skirmishes and negotiations alternated uneasily until the night of December 19, 1946, when fighting erupted in Hanoi. What had begun a sporadic resistance now transformed into a full-scale war. The First Indochina War at the outset. The Viet Minh faced daunting odds. The French Expeditionary Corps possessed modern artillery, armored vehicles, and aircraft, while the Vietnamese forces relied on outdated rifles, improvised explosives, and their knowledge of the countryside. The Viet Minh strategy was shaped by these realities. Rather than confront the French in conventional battles, they waged a relentless campaign of guerrilla warfare. They ambushed convoys, sabotaged supply lines, and melted into the dense jungles and mountains when the French counterattacked. For the French soldiers, this was a shadow war, fought against an enemy that could vanish as quickly as it appeared. The French response was to build fortified strong points, and to attempt to lure the Viet Minh into open confrontation, but the wider realities of the post-war world complicated their mission. By 1949, events far beyond Vietnam shifted the balance of power in Asia. The Chinese Communist Party, victorious after decades of civil war, established the People's Republic of China. This created a vast and sympathetic neighbor directly on the northern border of Vietnam. For the Viet Minh, it meant access to weapons, training, and safe havens that transformed their capabilities from a guerrilla movement into a more disciplined and better equipped fighting force. As the conflict deepened, certain battles revealed the changing nature of the war. At Ho Binh in 1952, French forces attempted to draw the Viet Minh into a decisive engagement by occupying a strategic region west of Hanoi for months. Fierce fighting raged. Though the French inflicted heavy casualties, the Viet Minh demonstrated that they could stand and fight in sustained combat, and by early 1952 the French withdrew. This was a costly warning that the war was no longer confined to ambushes and skirmishes. By 1953, the French command, desperate for a decisive victory, conceived a plan to establish a fortified base deep in the northwest at Dien Bien Phu. The objective was to cut off Viet Minh's supply routes into neighboring Laos, and to provoke a major battle on terms favorable to French firepower. But the plan underestimated the determination and logistical skill of their adversary. In one of the most remarkable feats of the war, tens of thousands of Viet Minh soldiers and civilian laborers transported heavy artillery through dense jungle and up steep mountainsides, placing their guns in positions overlooking the French garrison. The siege of Dien Bien Phu began in March 1954. For nearly 2 months, the French base was pounded from the surrounding hills. Trenches closed in around the encircled garrison as supply drops failed and morale collapsed. On May 7, 1954, after weeks of relentless bombardment and human wave assaults, the French defenses fell. The defeat shocked France and the wider world. An imperial power had been decisively beaten by a nationalist revolutionary force. In the aftermath, the Geneva Conference was convened to negotiate a settlement. The accords reached in July 1954 brought an end to French rule in Indochina. Vietnam was provisionally divided at the 17th parallel, with the north under the control of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the south under a separate, Western-backed government. National elections, intended to reunify the country, were promised but never held. The First Indochina War closed with the departure of the French, but the peace that followed was fragile, and beneath it smoldered the unresolved struggle over Vietnam's future, struggle soon to be drawn into the heart of the Cold War. The Geneva Settlement of 1954 brought the French colonial era to an end, but it did not bring Vietnam peace. Instead, the country stood divided along the 17th parallel, two political visions facing one another across a narrow demarcation line. In the north, The Democratic Republic of Vietnam, under Ho Chi Minh, consolidated power around a socialist program inspired by Marxism-Leninism. In the south, the state of Vietnam, later to become the Republic of Vietnam, came under the leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunchly anti-communist Catholic who quickly became the favored partner of the United States. For the leaders in Hanoi, the withdrawal of the French marked only the first stage of their struggle. The goals of the revolution, a reunified and independent Vietnam under their own rule, remained unfulfilled. In the countryside north of the dividing line, land reform was undertaken, often with brutal methods, redistributing estates and attempting to break the power of traditional landlords. The government began to rebuild after decades of war, drawing support and guidance from the Soviet Union and the newly established People's Republic of China. In the south, Diem rejected the nationwide elections promised at Geneva, fearing that Ho Chi Minh's popularity would ensure a communist victory. Backed by American funding and military advisors, Diem established an authoritarian regime that promised stability but delivered repression. Political opponents were imprisoned or executed, and the apparatus of power became concentrated among his family members and loyalists. The Catholic minority enjoyed privilege in a predominantly Buddhist nation, deepening resentment among much of the population. This growing discontent found expression in rural uprisings and clandestine organizing. By 1960, a new insurgent movement emerged, the National Liberation Front, more commonly known as the Viet Cong, composed of communists, nationalists, and those alienated by Diem's rule. The Viet Cong waged a campaign of guerrilla warfare across the Mekong Delta and Central Highlands. They drew upon the same tactics that had worn down the French ambushes: political propaganda and the ability to blend into the civilian population. The United States, seeing the hand of Hanoi behind the insurgency, began to increase its involvement. What began as a small advisory mission expanded steadily. American military advisors trained the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, in counterinsurgency tactics, while vast sums of U.S. aid propped up Diem's government. Despite these efforts, the Viet Cong gained strength, exploiting rural grievances and the corruption of the southern regime. By 1963, discontent boiled over into open confrontation between the government and the country's Buddhist majority. The immediate spark was the banning of Buddhist flags in Hue, which led to massive protests. When security forces fired on demonstrators, killing several, the crisis deepened. That summer, the world was shocked by images of Buddhist monks calmly setting themselves alight in public squares, desperate act of protest against what they saw as persecution. These images eroded Diem's legitimacy, even in the eyes of his American patrons. In the midst of this unrest, factions within the South Vietnamese military, with the tacit approval of U.S. officials, plotted a coup. On November 1, 1963, generals seized power. Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu attempted to flee, but were captured and executed the following day. The coup ended one form of authoritarianism, but it plunged South Vietnam into political chaos. The regime that replaced Diem was unstable, with leadership passing from one junta to another in rapid succession. The death of Diem marked the end of the first phase of the American experiment in Vietnam. Far from pacifying the countryside, the power vacuum opened by his assassination created a new and more dangerous instability, one that would soon draw the United States itself more deeply into the war. The fall of Ngo Dinh Diem did not halt the insurgency in South Vietnam. Instead, it accelerated. By 1964, the authority of the Saigon government extended little beyond the major cities, while the countryside fell increasingly under the shadow of the Viet Cong. Faced with this collapse, the United States began to assume direct responsibility for the war's outcome. What had begun as an advisory mission would soon become a full-scale American war. The catalyst came in August 1964, far from the rice paddies and jungles of the Mekong Delta, in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. Reports reached Washington that North Vietnamese patrol boats had attacked American destroyers conducting surveillance near their coast. A second, disputed attack was reported 2 days later. President Lyndon B. Johnson seized upon these incidents as evidence of unprovoked aggression. Within days, the United States Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting the President broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. The die was cast. In early 1965, Johnson ordered the first sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, known as Operation Rolling Thunder, and authorized the deployment of American combat troops. By year's end, nearly 200,000 U.S. soldiers were on the ground. 3 years later, that number would exceed 500,000. The war had been transformed into one of the largest military interventions in American history. The American strategy rested on attrition. Commanders sought to wear down the enemy through search and destroy missions, scouring the countryside for Viet Cong units, engaging them in battle, and measuring progress by the grim arithmetic of body counts. Helicopters, artillery, and airstrikes carried the war into the remotest corners of Vietnam, but the enemy proved elusive. They fought on their own terms, vanishing into tunnels and jungles after brief engagements. For every unit destroyed, another seemed to appear. In this war without clear front lines, civilians suffered disproportionately. Entire villages were destroyed in the course of operations. Bombing campaigns devastated the countryside, leaving craters where rice paddies once lay. Chemical defoliants such as Agent Orange stripped vast tracts of forest bare in an effort to deny the Viet Cong cover. But they also poisoned the land and the people who lived on it. Napalm, sticky, burning, and indiscriminate, became a symbol of the war's cruelty. For those who endured it, the war was not a distant policy but a constant presence. The thud of artillery, the scream of jets, the sudden terror of attack. Despite the massive application of American firepower, the Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese allies continued to grow stronger. They infiltrated the south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of hidden supply routes threading through Laos and Cambodia. The war dragged on, consuming lives and resources without producing a decisive result. Then, in January 1968, as the Vietnamese Lunar New Year approached, the North Vietnamese launched an audacious offensive that would shake American confidence to its core. Coordinated attacks struck cities, towns, and military bases across South Vietnam in what became known as the Tet Offensive. In Saigon, Viet Cong commandos even penetrated the grounds of the U.S. Embassy. For weeks, fierce fighting erupted in areas that had previously seemed secure. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for the attackers. Their forces suffered enormous casualties, and they failed to hold any major cities. Yet the psychological impact was profound. For the American public, who had been assured by their leaders that victory was near, the scale and ferocity of the offensive revealed a different reality, that the war was far from over, and the enemy remained determined and capable. Television brought the war's brutality into living rooms across the United States. The images of burning cities, of wounded soldiers, of civilians fleeing through smoke and rubble, eroded support for the conflict. By the end of 1968, President Johnson announced he would not seek re-election, and peace negotiations were opened. In Paris, Tet marked a turning point. Though the war would continue for 7 more years, the American escalation that had begun with confidence ended in doubt. The conviction that superior technology and numbers could impose victory on a determined foe had been tested, Dan found wanting. When Richard Nixon entered the White House in January 1969, he inherited a war that had already claimed tens of thousands of American lives and shattered public trust. The Tet Offensive had demonstrated the victory would not come easily. Nixon faced a paradox. He had campaigned on a promise to achieve peace with honor. Yet the path to such a peace seemed uncertain. His answer was a new policy that came to be known as Vietnamization. At its core, Vietnamization aimed to shift the burden of the fighting from American soldiers to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. U.S. troops would gradually withdraw, while American advisors, equipment, and air power would build up South Vietnam's ability to defend itself. It was a strategy designed not so much to win the war outright, but to create conditions under which the United States could disengage without appearing defeated. Even as withdrawals began, the war did not contract. In secret, the conflict widened. Believing that the North Vietnamese supply lines running through neighboring Cambodia and Laos were sustaining the insurgency, Nixon ordered a massive bombing campaign beyond Vietnam's borders. For years, American B-52s rained explosives on Cambodian jungles under a veil of secrecy. In 1970, U.S. and South Vietnamese troops crossed the border into Cambodia to attack enemy sanctuaries, and the following year a similar incursion was launched into Laos. These operations inflicted heavy casualties on North Vietnamese forces, but they also spread the war into new territories, destabilizing Cambodia and igniting a crisis that would have consequences long after the Vietnam conflict ended. At home, the patience of the American public was reaching its breaking point. The release of the Pentagon Papers, a secret history of the war compiled by the Department of Defense, revealed years of government deception and further eroded trust. College campuses erupted in protest. The most infamous of these demonstrations occurred at Kent State University in May 1970, when National Guard troops opened fire on unarmed students protesting the Cambodian invasion. 4 students were killed, and the image of their bodies on the grass shocked a nation already weary of violence. Despite the turmoil, the withdrawal of U.S. troops continued. By 1972, American ground forces played a largely supporting role, though air power remained decisive. That year, the North Vietnamese launched the so-called Easter Offensive, a conventional invasion designed to test the strength of the South Vietnamese army. The attack pushed deep into the south, but with massive American air support, including the devastating B-52 bombings of Operation Linebacker, the offensive was halted. Still, the fighting made clear that without US firepower, the South's survival was uncertain. In the diplomatic arena, secret negotiations had been underway in Paris for years. Henry Kissinger, representing the United States, sought an agreement that would allow for withdrawal while leaving a non-communist government in Saigon. By late 1972, an accord was within reach, but it required a final display of force. In December, Nixon ordered an intense bombing campaign over Hanoi and Haiphong, known as the Christmas bombings, to pressure the North into concessions. On January 27, 1973, The Paris Peace Accords was signed. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of all remaining American combat troops, the exchange of prisoners of war, and a promise that the future of Vietnam would be decided by its own people. For the United States, the war was effectively over, yet beneath the signatures and ceremonies, little had truly changed on the ground. The ceasefire was fragile, and both North and South prepared for further conflict. As the last American soldiers departed that spring, the war that had consumed a generation entered its final, decisive act of struggle now left almost entirely in Vietnamese hands. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 marked the end of direct American involvement in Vietnam. But they did not bring an end to the war. What remained was an uneasy truce between two very unequal adversaries. North Vietnam retained its vast supply lines through Laos and Cambodia, while in the south the government of Saigon, weakened by years of political infighting and corruption, found itself struggling to hold its ground despite a continued flow of American aid. The absence of American combat troops changed everything. For 2 years after the Accords, both sides probed and fought, their ceasefire more a formality than a reality. The United States, exhausted by a decade of war and shaken by the Watergate scandal, had no appetite for renewed escalation. What remained of its commitment was financial and material, weapons, equipment, and advisors, but no soldiers. Without American air power and without the presence of 500,000 U.S. troops, the balance tipped inexorably in favor of the North. In March 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a major offensive across the Central Highlands. The South Vietnamese defense crumbled with startling speed. Cities fell one after another, and soon there was a panicked retreat from the highlands to the coastal plains. By April, the North's advance was unstoppable. Saigon itself, the capital and symbol of the southern state, stood as the last refuge. On April 30th, 1975, the war ended. North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the city as helicopters ferried the last American personnel from the rooftop of the U.S. Embassy. The images captured that morning the long lines of desperate South Vietnamese at the gates, the rotor blades whipping the air as helicopters lifted off became indelible symbols of the war's chaotic conclusion. By midday, the flags of the North flew over the presidential palace. The Republic of Vietnam had ceased to exist. In the months that followed, the country was formally reunified under the rule of the Communist Party. What remained, however, was a landscape scarred by decades of war. The human toll was staggering. By conservative estimates, more than 2 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians had lost their lives. Millions more were wounded or displaced. The countryside bore the marks of relentless bombing and artillery fire. Entire villages had been erased, forests stripped bare, rivers poisoned. For the people of Vietnam, the task of rebuilding was immense. Reunification brought the promise of independence, but it also meant years of economic hardship and social upheaval. Many who had fought alongside the United States or served in the Southern government fled the country, embarking on perilous journeys as refugees. For those who remained, there began the slow and painful work of reconstruction. The legacy of the war was not confined to Vietnam. In the United States, the conflict left deep divisions and a crisis of confidence. It was a war fought on television screens as much as on battlefields, and its images haunted a generation. Burning villages, body bags, the haunted eyes of soldiers who could not explain why they were there. The war forced Americans to reckon with the limits of their power and the cost of intervention in a conflict shaped by history, nationalism, and ideology. The Vietnam War was not a single battle or a single decision, but the culmination of a century of collisions between empires and the colonized, between competing visions of nationhood, and between superpowers locked in the global Cold War. It was a war that began as resistance to colonial rule escalated into a civil conflict and became a proxy for ideological confrontation. It left scars that can still be traced in the villages of Vietnam and in the political memory of the United States. And yet, beyond the ruins and the loss, there remains the image of resilience, a nation that endured centuries of domination and 30 years of near constant war, and, at tremendous cost, emerged unified. The story of Vietnam is, in the end, the story of a people who, though battered by history, never surrendered their determination to decide their own fate.